Last year, we celebrated the 40th annual WrestleMania pay-per-view. So in today's video, I'm going to be tier ranking all 40 of them. Now, before we get started, a couple of quick disclaimers. Firstly, of course, I'm a younger fan. My first WrestleMania was WrestleMania 25. I mean, maybe that doesn't make me a younger fan anymore. I don't know. But the fact is, maybe there is a level of bias towards WrestleManias after that point compared to before it. I have gone back, obviously, and watched all of the WrestleManias, right? But when you're not watching them at the time, perhaps that does impact how you view the event as a whole. The second disclaimer is very simply, I'm going to go through these as fast as possible so this video doesn't last forever. Now let's get into it. First things first, WrestleMania 1. Now, if you take away all the spectacle of this being the first ever WrestleMania, the show sucked. It truly did, right? I mean, to be honest with you, the best match on the card was probably the World Tag Team title match, but even that, I wouldn't really recommend checking out. But at the same time, the spectacle of it being the first ever WrestleMania does mean I probably would, I guess, recommend watching it just for that, but even still, I am going to put it in the trash. Now time for WrestleMania 2, which is widely regarded as the worst WrestleMania of all time. They tried to do it in 3 different places and somehow managed to do 3 awful shows in 3 different places, with the New York show being a complete and utter disaster. I mean, that boxing match was just horrifically bad. Now, the best match undoubtedly was the British Bulldogs versus the Dream Team, which I believe was in Chicago. Yeah, it was. But, I mean, that's the only thing from this entire show which is worth checking out. But 3 different places, 3 bad shows, I'm sorry. But this was so diabolical, it made me sick. Now time for WrestleMania 3, and this one was a lot better. In fact, this is the first one which is probably actually worth a watch. Now, there were still a couple of stinkers on the card, but we did have Randy Savage versus Ricky Steamboat, definitely worth checking out. Plus, of course, the main event, Hulk Hogan, Andre the Giant. The Unstoppable Force versus the Immovable Object. I mean, that slam is an all-time moment, right? And yes, as a match, it's nothing overly special, but it's still just a fantastic moment in the history of this business. So while the card isn't anything amazing, there is a few things worth checking out, but I will still put it in a thumbs down category. Now time for WrestleMania 4, and the big story for this WrestleMania was the fact there was a world title tournament throughout it, and because of this, there was tons of short matches. It did not feel like a WrestleMania at all. But there were glimpses of good wrestling on it, and I mean, I wouldn't say it's a bad show, right? Like, as a show, it does make sense. It just doesn't feel like a WrestleMania. And there is nothing, not one match, which I'm like, yeah, that's worth checking out. And in fact, I've just looked at the card again now, right, and it's even worse than I remember it, honestly. I mean, there are just so many stinkers on it. But, I mean, like, as a show, it told a story throughout it, which is the only thing which stops me being sick looking at it. But still, it's a steaming pile of dump. And unfortunately, WrestleMania 5, the 5th anniversary, doesn't get much better. Again, just tons of short matches, most of them under-delivered. There was so much sloppiness throughout it. And the best match on the card was actually a Hulk Hogan match. Hulk Hogan versus Randy Savage in the main event. That is worth, well, I don't know if it's worth checking out. But out of all the matches on it was by far the best one and the most memorable by miles as well. But even still, it belongs in the steaming pile of dump. But if you were hoping WrestleMania 6 would break the streak, it absolutely does not. Again, a steaming pile of dump. And once again, a Hulk Hogan match, actually the best match of the night in the main event. But honestly, this Mania, again, tons of short matches. None of them were very good. I mean, let's be real, the state of wrestling at this point was just not great looking back on it. Again, maybe this is an age thing, right? That is entirely possible, of course. You know, I wasn't alive for this, so maybe looking back on it now, it looks a lot worse than it was at the time. But for me, I mean, this was basically a snooze fest. I do feel like I'm going to get some hate for this. Now, WrestleMania 7, I thought this was a much better show until I got into the second half of it. But the first half is actually really enjoyable, and of course, it is capped off by easily the match of the night, the Ultimate Warrior versus Randy Savage. Really, really fun, of course, a massively memorable match as well in the history of WrestleMania, but the second half of the show, it just stunk. But the first half of the show does save it from being anything awful, but still it does belong in the trash because the second half of the show really messed things up. I'd almost actually recommend just watching the first half of this show. Now, WrestleMania 8 follows the exact same theme. Phenomenal first half of the show, better than the first half of WrestleMania 7, but the second half of the show is actually worse than the second half of WrestleMania 7. But the first half did feature Bret Hart versus Roddy Piper, and this match I actually saw years before I actually watched WrestleMania 8 in full, but it is a really, really fun match. And of course, Randy Savage versus Ric Flair, which I watched a couple of years ago as well. So I do recommend watching the first half of this show. It's really good. But the second half of the show, it is absolutely abysmal. So overall, I'll say a thumbs down. I mean, the finish is literally a botched DQ. Well, WrestleMania 9 can't get much worse, can it? Well, it absolutely can. This one absolutely stunk. In fact, it was so diabolical, it makes me sick. I mean, we had the entire Hulk Hogan Yokozuna nonsense, but also we had the worst Undertaker WrestleMania match, and that says something, right? Because there are a few stinkers during that reign, but the Undertaker versus Giant Gonzalez, it was just horrific. Nothing at all worth checking out on this one. Now we're on to WrestleMania 10, and finally a good WrestleMania. Finally a WrestleMania I recommend checking out, and I will give it a thumbs up. Now on any other WrestleMania, Bret Hart versus Owen Hart would be match of the night, and to some people it even is on this one, right? But there is also, of course, the famous ladder match. What, in my opinion, is undoubtedly top 3 ladder matches of all time. To some people, it is easily the first. Razor Ramon, Shawn Michaels. It was phenomenal. Now, there were also a couple of stinkers on the card, right? It wasn't just all good, but those 2 matches alone were by absolute miles and miles better than anything else at this point. So I'll say it only gets a thumbs up purely because the rest of the card isn't anything special. Up next with WrestleMania 11, and honestly, all the steps they took forward, they just took back. In fact, this was so diabolical, it made me sick. There's nothing even worth checking out on this card. And then WrestleMania 12 follows the same pattern, but there is a great main event match between Shawn Michaels and Bret Hart. It's a 60-minute Iron Man match, and it is worth checking out. Now, it is a little long at times, right? But even still, especially for back then, this was a really, really fun main event. Actually, I'm thinking about it. This was probably, to this point, the best WrestleMania main event. In fact, it must have been, yeah. But the rest of the card was so bad, I will overall still give it a thumbs down. Up next, we have WrestleMania 13. Now, again, there was a couple of stinkers on this, but there was also arguably one of the greatest matches of all time. Some people say the greatest. Stone Cold versus Bret Hart. To this point, in my opinion, this was the best WrestleMania match. I mean, if you haven't seen it, make sure you check it out. It is one of those matches you have to watch as a wrestling fan, and it massively helps this event. I mean, the main event was Undertaker Psycho Sid. The less said about that, the better. But the Chicago 6-man street fight was fun as well. But overall, I'll say this was a decent show, massively helped by one match. Up next, we had WrestleMania 14, and this was actually quite a fun WrestleMania, right? Again, there was quite a few matches not necessarily worth checking out, and they were quite short, but everything was at least decent at this point for the most part. We had Undertaker versus Kane, which was a lot of fun, and of course, the main event, Stone Cold Steve Austin versus Shawn Michaels. Now, that's not quite as good as I think you'd presume, but still, it was fun, it was enjoyable, and this WrestleMania overall had a couple of bad moments, quite a few good moments, but it was just, steadily okay, so I'll put this in the I don't care tier. Oh, I almost forgot. The Tag Team Battle Royale, to skip it at the start. That actually, this brings this down from a decent to an I don't care. But then WrestleMania 15 and all the steps they just took forward, they just took them all back. This was a steaming pile of dump, and the only reason it didn't make me sick was Stone Cold versus The Rock, a really enjoyable main event. I mean, again, it's not an all-time match, but it is it's a hugely iconic match, and it is fun to watch. For the rest of the card, it was bad. Up next with WrestleMania 16, and this featured the 3-way ladder match between Christian and Edge, the Dudley Boys, and the Hardy Boys. I mean, they basically then for a few years just had banger tag team ladder matches or whatever every other year. They always did, and they were always a lot of fun. And this was the first of those, and it is worth checking out. I mean, apart from there, the card is kind of better than the matches actually are. In fact, I was actually quite disappointed by a few matches on the card. I mean, Chris Jericho, Chris Benoit, and Kurt Angle, you'd expect to be an absolute banger of a match. but quite frankly, it was bizarre with the double title stipulation, but also, like, it just didn't deliver as much as you'd expect. Then the world title four-way, I mean, it's again not as good as you'd expect. Triple H, Mick Foley, Big Show, and The Rock. I mean, it was just massively long, right? It felt like an hour long. It was only 38 minutes. It felt a lot longer. So a bit of a disappointing WrestleMania, but that tag ladder match does massively save it. So I'll just say thumbs down overall. But up next, WrestleMania X7 17. This one was a banger of a broadcast. In many people's eyes, the greatest WrestleMania of all time, and why wouldn't it be? With absolute bangers like Angle versus Chris Benoit. Obviously, Benoit, awful person, but in ring, unbelievable. We had Shane McMahon versus Vince McMahon, which actually was a lot of fun. We had a TLC match, the first TLC match, I believe, between Christian Edge, the Dudley Boys, and the Hardy Boys. I mentioned it last WrestleMania, but these guys had a series of bangers, and this one was even better than the last. Undertaker Triple H was fun, not as good as their later matches, but still fun. And the main event, this was miles better than the match a couple of years prior. Stone Cold versus The Rock. Hell of a main event. But also, this show was just steadily really enjoyable throughout as well. So until a few years ago, a lot of people did say this was the greatest WrestleMania, and even now a lot of people say it. WrestleMania 18 then does take a couple of steps backwards, but does still feature The Rock versus Hollywood Hogan, of course, that iconic showdown, and was, quite a few enjoyable matches in between. But at the same time, a lot of matches did underdeliver and not really get enough time, in my opinion. So I'm just going to say I don't really care too much about this one. WrestleMania 19 is then again the other end of the scale, the top end of the scale, widely considered to be one of the best WrestleManias of all time. Now, I don't think it's as good as 17. That is an argument people have always had, 17 on 19. I did prefer 17. And a big reason for that is The Undertaker versus The A-Train and The Big Show. That really stunk up the joint for me. Matt Hardy versus Rey Mysterio, I didn't really enjoy as much as other people did. But there was Shawn Michaels versus Chris Jericho, an absolute banger. Hogan versus Vince was fun, nothing special but fun. And The Rock and Stone Cold had another banger, not quite as good as the one a couple of years prior. And in the main event, Lesnar versus Angle was a lot of fun as well. So overall, I'll say this WrestleMania can take my money, but it's not quite a banger. Now, WrestleMania 20 is a weird mania, right? And in fact, a lot of manias from this point follows this theme, where there's quite a few stinkers throughout, but there's also a lot of great wrestling as well. Chris Jericho was a banger. And the main event, Benoit versus Michaels versus Triple H, was a hell of a lot of fun as well. Obviously, in hindsight, not as good of a moment as it was at the time. But Eddie Guerrero versus Kurt Angle was also a really, really great match. Big negative, Goldberg versus Brock Lesnar. Now, both of these guys were on the way out of the company, and it was a complete and utter disaster. It was a complete botch fest, in fact. But I'll say a thumbs up overall. Now, WrestleMania 21 is a mania I really remember fondly, right? Pretty much every match was great. Now, there was the sumo match and a couple of other moments throughout, which wasn't quite as consistent. But even still, I really enjoyed this mania. Like Batista versus Triple H in the main event, I get it. People said it was a bit of a drag and they didn't have much chemistry. I didn't hate it as much as other people, but still, I get it. But Undertaker versus Orton is fun. Mysterio, Eddie Guerrero is really fun. The Money in the Bank ladder match, I believe this was the first Money in the Bank ladder match, was a hell of a lot of fun with Edge winning as well. And of course, Kurt Angle versus Shawn Michaels. It was a banger. So this event gets a subtle round of applause from me. WrestleMania 22 wasn't quite as good, but it honestly was not miles off, right? Edge, Mick Foley, undoubtedly the highlight. But again, throughout, just a lot of fun. There was no real absolute stinkers. There was a couple of matches, not quite as good, including the 2-on-1 handicap match, which I'm going to be honest, I completely forgot about until I just read it there. And of course, Undertaker versus Mark Henry wasn't great as well. But we did have Shawn Michaels versus Vince McMahon. Rey Mysterio finally winning the world title, one of my favorite moments in wrestling of all time. And again, so overall, it was an enjoyable mania. I'll give it a thumbs up. Now, WrestleMania 23 did have a couple of bad matches on it again. Great Khali versus Kane, the 8-man tag, the hair versus hair match. I understand that was a lot of fun, but still, I just hated it. I mean, maybe more goes into that, but hey. But Shawn Michaels versus John Cena in the main event, I did enjoy. And Undertaker versus Batista was very fun as well. So overall, I'll say this is a decent, right? The highs were high, the lows were low. Now, WrestleMania 24, this one deserves my applause. Right before I got into it, and I went back and watched it, and it was so good. And I watched it when I was very young too. Maybe that impacts it a little bit. But Shawn Michaels, Ric Flair, I'm sorry, I love you. That was just so brilliant. One of my favorite moments ever in professional wrestling. Plus, the rest of the card was a hell of a lot of fun too. Undertaker Edge is a standout. And I do just remember as a kid watching this and this being so much fun. Again, maybe that impacts it a little bit, but I don't care. Such a round of applause from me. Then my first WrestleMania, WrestleMania 25. Featuring arguably the greatest match of all time, Undertaker, Shawn Michaels. It was phenomenal. But also, a lot of people don't like Matt versus Jeff from this show. And again, maybe it's the fact I watched this as a kid, but I absolutely adored it. Even going back and watching it now, I enjoy it. And yes, the main event was long. The main event was a bit boring between Triple H and Randy Orton. But again, maybe it was because I was invested into it as a kid, but I still enjoyed it. But listen, right, I admit, if you didn't have as much investment into it, I understand why a few people have a few issues. Still, I'm giving it a thumbs up. Up next, WrestleMania 26. Now, I'm not going to lie, a lot did disappoint on this show. I was so invested in the Mysterio and CM Punk storyline, and the match it went 6 minutes. It didn't live up to the hype, did it? Also, Bret Hart versus Vince was horrifically bad. But Jericho vs. Edge was a lot of fun. And of course, the real highlight of this Mania, the real standout, in fact, probably the only reason you'll watch this WrestleMania, was the main event. Undertaker HBK Part 2 with Shawn Michaels and his career on the line. A phenomenal story, one of my favorite stories in the history of professional wrestling. And of course, heartbreakingly, The Undertaker won. So I'll say overall, this WrestleMania was in the decent tier purely because other than the WrestleMania main event and Edge versus Jericho, there's not really anything worth checking out. Now, time for WrestleMania 27, the biggest WrestleMania of all time, they said. In reality, a lot of people say it's one of the worst. Of course, it featured Michael Cole versus Jerry Lawler, horrifically bad, as you'd expect, one of the worst matches of all time, plus The Miz versus John Cena in the main event, massively under-delivered too. But it did feature The Undertaker versus Triple H, and this is why I cannot call this the worst WrestleMania of all time, right? That match was an absolute banger. Plus, Orton versus Punk was fun as well. Cody versus Ray I enjoyed. I'm sorry, guys, I just don't think this is anywhere near the worst. But even still, it undoubtedly does belong in the trash, right? There was so much rubbish on it. Now, WrestleMania 28, Hell in a Cell, Triple H versus Undertaker. That's what I remember this show by. One of the best, one of the greatest Hell in a Cell matches of all time. And honestly, that is an easy 5-star match for me. I know a lot of people disagree with that. I don't. This is arguably the greatest match of Triple H's career. Plus, Punk versus Jericho was a lot of fun as well. And Rock versus Cena, it was not once in a lifetime, but it was still extremely fun. So this gets a thumbs up from me. I understand people don't like it as much because there were a few stinkers during it. Okay, but there was also so much gold. Now, WrestleMania 29, very weird Mania. Didn't really feel like a Mania outside of the final 3 matches. Of course, we had Undertaker, CM Punk, a banger. Triple H versus Brock Lesnar with Triple H's career on the line. I'm going to be honest, I didn't really like that as a match. But it was, it massively disappointed. If you check it out, right, and let me know your thoughts. And then in the main event, Cena versus Rock. Rock got hurt early in this match, and it was not as good as that previous one. But it was still enjoyable. But the entire first half of the card absolutely stung up the gaff, right? Final 3 matches were at least noteworthy. Triple H versus Brock Lesnar. Thinking about it back now, I really didn't like it at the time. But, they do show highlights from it all the time, even to this day. So I'll put it in that I don't care tier. Now, WrestleMania 30, the big highlight of this Mania was the story of the Yes Movement. Daniel Bryan winning the opening match against Triple H, being added to the main event and making it a triple threat match, and then winning that match. It was a phenomenal story, wasn't it? Plus, you had Cena versus Bray Wyatt, a great story. Yes, not an unbelievable match, but a great story nevertheless. And of course, the streak ending, but the less said about that, the better. But even still, right, the Daniel Bryan storyline, it was so good. It can take my money, screw it. Come at me in the comments. But WrestleMania 31 can also take my money. I'm going to say it out of the gates, right? The Seth Rollins cash in, the heist of the century. This WrestleMania from start until finish felt like a WrestleMania. So much fun, so easy to watch. In fact, this WrestleMania is probably the one I've actually gone back and rewatched the most, strangely. Now, time for a hot take. Time for the hottest take in this entire video. WrestleMania 32. It was not as bad as everyone says. It wasn't. Now, I did take a few years off from wrestling at this point, and this was the WrestleMania that got me back into it, right? Did Brock Lesnar and Dean Ambrose massively underdeliver and just suck because neither cared? Absolutely. Was the Andre the Giant Battle Royale in a really weird place on the card? Absolutely. And did the main event drag on a bit? Absolutely. I still don't think it's anywhere near as bad as people say, though. I mean, On Cage Match has got a 2.5 rating. That is nonsense. But it was fun. It felt like a big WrestleMania, and the Intercontinental Ladder match to kick off the show was absolutely phenomenal. But the match of the night was Charlotte versus Sasha Banks versus Becky Lynch. That was a banger. Not enough people talk about that match. Jericho versus Styles was fun as well, and so was The Undertaker versus Shane McMahon. I loved that match. So screw it. I don't care what everybody says. I'm saying it was decent. And I'm going to make that take even more controversial by saying WrestleMania 33 was worse and I didn't really care for it. Because yes, Styles vs. Shane McMahon was fun, but pretty much everything else on this card under-delivered. I mean, Lesnar versus Goldberg was actually the next best thing, which I genuinely is up there with the greatest matches under 5 minutes in history. In fact, maybe my favorite under 5 minute match in history. But that main event, I mean, it stunk. That was properly bad. This was what everybody said Roman Reigns versus Triple H was. Reigns versus Taker. I mean, it was just so bad. Now, WrestleMania 34 was a really enjoyable WrestleMania, right? From start until finish, it did feel like a WrestleMania as well. Seth Rollins, Finn Balor and The Miz it was in a triple threat match. That was a great opener. Flair versus Asuka was a true banger as well. Kurt Angle and Ronda Rousey versus Triple H and Stephanie was massively better than I expected it to be. Styles versus Nakamura did under-deliver and the crowd didn't really care for it. That is one negative. But also we had Daniel Bryan return to the ring with Shane McMahon to take on Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. We also had a 10-year-old win the tag team titles with Braun Strowman. That sucked. And the main event between Brock and Roman Reigns wasn't great either. But I did enjoy this Mania. So I'll say it was decent. Now, WrestleMania 35. Let's start with the highlight of it. Kofi Mania. Kofi finally winning the big one. What a match against Daniel Bryan. And also what a story. But boy oh boy did this save this Mania, honestly. Rollins Lesnar was fun, but went literally 2 minutes. The SmackDown Tag Team Ladder match, not even ladder match, sorry, Fatal 4-Way, was also really fun as well. Styles versus Orton, I thought, massively under-delivered. And Samoa Joe squashed Rey Mysterio, which just completely shocked me and stunned me at the time. Reigns and McIntyre was just not good. Angle got retired by Baron Corbin in the match, which absolutely stunk. And in the main event, we had Becky versus Charlotte versus Ronda Rousey, which was not a bad match. It had a bad finish, but was not a bad match. The issue was, this card was so long. And that was the issue it had, right? Because there were moments of gold. Triple H versus Batista was a lot of fun as well. But it just dragged on. And everybody was exhausted by the end of it. Nobody could get home because of how late it finished. They just ended up being a disaster. So I'll say thumbs down overall, saved by a couple of good matches. Now, WrestleMania 36, the pandemic WrestleMania, really incredibly a hard one to rate, isn't it? I'm going to say I don't care, right? I'm going to stick it there because I really did enjoy the cinematic matches. I also did enjoy the fact they gave us something to watch during those, early scary days of the pandemic. But at the same time, obviously, there was no crowd, and a crowd is what makes wrestling, right? So I can't really give it higher than I don't care. WrestleMania 37 is known for having a few matches which did underdeliver, undeniably so, but it also featured Bianca Belair versus Sasha Banks, which is one of my favorite WrestleMania main events of all time. Those two ladies killed it. It brought a tear to everyone's eye. It was phenomenal. And then on night 2, Roman Reigns, Daniel Bryan, and Edge, another banger as well. Plus Rhea Ripley versus Asuka, which I thoroughly enjoyed as well. And Kevin Owens versus Sami Zayn. Now, obviously, Randy Orton versus The Fiend did absolutely stink. But still, a lot of good on this WrestleMania. And it was just great to have fans back again as well. So maybe that gives this a little bit of an unfair advantage. But I don't care. Subtle round of applause from me. And 38, I'll give a subtle round of applause to as well. Not only did it feature the return of Stone Cold Steve Austin, but it also featured the return of Cody Rhodes against Seth Rollins. What a banger those two had. Plus Bianca Belair versus Becky Lynch, a banger in itself too. Now, night 2 was not as good as night 1, right? And of course, featured Mr. McMahon versus Pat McAfee. It was very weird. Plus Austin Theory, Pat McAfee too. Plus Edge versus AJ Styles, which didn't quite live up to the hype for me personally. But I still really enjoyed this Mania. I think off WrestleMania 38 night 1 alone, it would have actually scored a bit higher, maybe even approaching money territory. But I'll just give it a subtle round of applause because night 2 did bring it down a bit. Now, WrestleMania 39. I was there for it, right? I'm going to be biased. I don't care. This can take my money. Now, this does take every little bit of me to stop this from actually being a banger of a broadcast, right? But I was there for it. It was so good. Rhea Ripley versus Charlotte Flair. Whoo, what a match. Also in the main event, the Usos versus Kevin Owens and Sami Zayn. They finally defeated the Bloodline. It was truly phenomenal. Plus Seth Rollins versus Logan Paul. That was a really fun match I forgot about as well. And that's just night 1, right? Because night 2, yes, it features Lesnar versus Omos and the Fatal 4-Way Women's Tag Team match, which I just didn't really enjoy. But it also did feature Roman Reigns versus Cody Rhodes. And yes, the audience were crying about it, but that match was a banger. And so was Gunther, Drew McIntyre, and Sheamus. In fact, you know what? Screw what I said. I don't care. I'm buckling into the pressure of myself. This was a banger of a broadcast. We'll just ignore Snoop Dogg versus The Miz. Although I say that, he saved it, right? He saved that entire thing with Shane injuring himself, so I don't care. Right, now time for WrestleMania 40, last year's WrestleMania, which I think does hold a special place in everyone's heart. Firstly, Rhea Ripley, Becky Lynch. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Sami Zayn also dethroned Gunther as well. And yes, Jay versus Jimmy did massively under-deliver, and there was a couple of mediocre matches on the middle of night 1. But the end of night 2, the Bloodline, Roman Reigns and The Rock versus Cody Rhodes and Seth Rollins. I know some people said it went on too long. I know a lot of people said that. I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I thoroughly enjoyed it from start until finish. But then night 2, it went up so many levels. McIntyre versus Rollins, a 10-minute sprint, which was truly a banger. Then we had the cash-in, which was a great moment from Damian Priest. Logan Paul versus Kevin Owens and Randy Orton was a really enjoyable match. And so was Bayley versus Io Sky. They delivered an absolute banger. And then in the main event, 5-star classic, Cody Rhodes ended the iconic, the legendary reign of Roman Reigns. So you know what, WrestleMania 40, it's a bang of a broadcast. So there we have it, guys, my tier list. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Very much was a long video. I expected it to be a lot shorter. Hopefully it was enjoyable though, and hopefully you guys enjoyed. If you did, please leave a thumbs up and subscribe, and let me know your thoughts in the comments down below. I will see you in the next video. Peace.